So I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to talk about the Battle of Hatcher's Run, February the 5th to the 7th, 1865. You'll see that I've rebranded the event now as Grant's 8th Petersburg Offensive. The reason I do this is basically people have heard of Grant and Petersburg, but faces tend to glaze over when I say I want to give a talk or write an article about Hatcher's Run. So it's true to say that posterity hasn't treated this battle particularly kindly. And spoiler alert, my tale has a sting in it. So I hope you all stick around to the end to see what that's about. So just to give a bit of Civil War context, it's clear to see that in the start of 1865, the Confederacy wasn't in a very good shape at all. They lost control of the Shenandoah Valley, which had provided succor to them throughout the war. The re-election of President Lincoln in November all but ended any hopes the Confederacy had of having any form of independence at all. Sherman's army was marching northwards through the Carolinas. Their main army in the western theatre, the Army of Tennessee, had been crushed in December, and their last remaining Atlantic port, Wilmington in North Carolina, was effectively cut off. Their main army was General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, and they've been penned in around Petersburg and Richmond since June of 1864. And this is the area that I'm going to be talking about today. So probably deserving a lecture in its own right, on February the 3rd, 1865, a famous peace conference occurred on the steamship River Queen, which was moored outside of Norfolk, Virginia, where Abraham Lincoln and his Secretary of State met with three Confederate peace envoys. Although the meeting was cordial and friendly, it soon broke down, as it inevitably would have done, as they couldn't agree terms, and the war would continue. So while the peace envoys were making their way safely back to Richmond to report to the government there, General Grant was keen for further action on the Petersburg front. His last offensive had taken place in early December 1864, and that had been to disrupt the Weldon Railroad here all the way south to Belfield. But what he'd learnt was that rebel trains were still arriving at this junction. They were offloading their supplies onto covered wagons, floating them up the Marahan River and then on to Petersburg via the Boyden Plank Road here, and thus providing support to the Confederate war effort. So Grant decided that this supply route needed to be disrupted or completely broken down. So that was his target and that was his thinking. Such that on noon Saturday, February the 4th, the day after the peace conference, he ordered General Meade, who was the commander of the Army of the Potomac, to send his cavalry division all the way south to Belfield and disrupt or destroy the rebel supply line. Now, this cavalry raid was somewhat of an impromptu and flawed plan, looking at it in retrospect, and I've recently written an article about that. Such that later on in the afternoon, Meade, having digested the plan, came up with his own counter proposal and said, wouldn't it be better if we disrupted the supply line here at Dinwiddie Courthouse? And he provided numerous examples of why this was a far superior plan. And to Grant's credit, he agreed with him, and they came up with a plan. But with the aim was that the cavalry raid was going to start at 3 o'clock the following morning, so that's less than 10 hours' time. So this is the general plan. So if we just concentrate on the orange for the time being, this is the Union Cavalry Division commanded by General David Gray. They leave their camps out here. The plan is to go there, cross Roundtree Creek, head west to Dinwiddie Courthouse, patrol up and down the Boyd and Plank Road, causing as much damage and chaos to their supply line as they can before hightailing it back to safety and the Union lines, which are here. Now, being stuck out here, you're in somewhat dangerous territory. So to support the cavalry, Warren's entire 5th Infantry Corps are ordered to out of their camps to a position on the western end of Bourne Road. So they're fairly in close proximity to Dinwiddie Courthouse in case the cavalry get into any difficulties. And to cover Warren's back, Humphreys with 2 divisions of the 2nd Corps are ordered to capture these 2 crossings along Hatcher's Run. Mainly this is to stop the Confederates, whose main lines are here protecting the Boyd and Plank Road, from charging out here and cutting off either Warren or Gregg from the Union line. So that was the general plan. So I'll now talk about the 3 forces in turn. So General Gregg, as ordered, set off at 3 o'clock in the morning and travelled to Dinwiddie Courthouse. They had a bit of a scuffle getting across the Roundtree Creek, which unfortunately I don't have time to tell you that interesting story. And despite the treacherous winter roads, the troops got to Dinwiddie Courthouse around noon. But much to their surprise, they found that the supply route had been largely abandoned. In fact, Grant's intelligence had been out of date, and as conceived, the mission was thus pointless. So having patrolled up and down the Boyd and Plank Road, capturing a few wagons and a few prisoners, they headed back to relative safety at Malone's Bridge. Warren had set off at 7 in the morning. They got to their agreed position in the late afternoon, having been severely held up trying to get across Roundtree Creek because a small Confederate force had destroyed their bridge at Monk's Neck. And they also dug in rifle pits on the opposite bank to contest any crossing. So this took them quite a while to overwhelm that Confederate force. There's lots of tales of daring do, and so, as you see here, soldiers having to cross the Roundtree Creek, which at that time of year was virtually frozen over, the thin layer of ice. So there's quite some stories there. But they did eventually overwhelm the small Confederate force and got across. But then they had to rebuild the bridge sufficiently strong enough for it to take artillery and their wagons. So they were quite significantly delayed, but they did get into position during late afternoon. So just a quick reminder so you get used to the geography. So Gregg's cavalry's been to Dinwiddie Courthouse, found nothing, are now heading on their way back. Warren's eventually got to here, having had a bit of a scuffle here at Monk's Neck Bridge. He's here starting to encamp and waiting for further orders. So that just leaves the Humphreys and the Purple Force. They've been tasked with capturing these 2 strategic crossings here. So what has happened to them? What is their story? Well, they set off at 7 o'clock as well, and much to Humphrey's relief and surprise, I would imagine, they managed to easily capture the 2 strategic crossings by 10 o'clock that morning, losing less than 20 men. So Humphrey started to funnel his force across Hatcher's Run, and they started to dig in the afternoon about 1,000 yards just south of the main Confederate trenches protecting the Boyd and Plank Road. So what have the Confederates been up to meantime? Well, they'd clearly been caught on the hop. Perhaps they wasn't expecting an offensive in the middle of winter. But Lee only received news of the Union offensive in the late morning while he was at church in Petersburg, it being a Sunday. So he rushed back to his army lines and met with Corps Commanders A.P. Hill and General Gordon. They were particularly concerned about the Second Corps taking the two crossings and now entrenching about 1,000 yards from their main rebel defences, securing Boyd and Plank Road. Perhaps they thought that this was a rerun of Grant's 6th offensive, where he tried to turn the Confederate right. So clearly something had to be done. And this, in brief, a long story short, and a very misunderstood part of the battle, is what was planned. So effectively, Lee ordered an all-out attack on Humphreys' line here, involved 3 brigades east of Rocky Branch and 3 brigades west of Rocky Branch. So the first attack went in just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that was heavily repelled with great loss. 2 more times, the Confederates tried to break the Union line here, and both ended up with the same result, and both were heavily repelled, mainly because of bad tactics and rather futile attacking on the western side of the Rocky Branch. So despite Lee's urging of further attacks, and with night falling, the dejected Confederate soldiers trudged back north to their trenches here. So the Union soldiers were jubilant with achieving this great victory. However, Meade and Humphreys were quite concerned because things could have turned out quite differently. So they were somewhat worried. I think their main fear was that the Confederates would regroup overnight and attack perhaps in greater force, and perhaps the Federals might not be so fortunate the next time. So with Grant's blessing, Meade ordered Warren and Gregg from their positions to join Humphreys ASAP. He also called up reinforcements, 2 further divisions, to get to Humphreys' position, which he considered was quite vulnerable. So overnight, most of those Union forces got to within Humphreys' position. So as dawn broke on February the 6th, Meade was feeling a lot more secure and content. He'd managed to concentrate all his forces around the Hatcher's Run crossing, so that was a lot more stable. So he ordered both Humphreys and Warren to probe their fronts and see what the rebels were up to. And if there were any found outside of their main defences, they were to be driven in. But they weren't under any circumstances allowed to attack any rebels behind their earthworks. So Humphreys duly complied with this order, sent out a few regiments on his front, found there was no rebels there, so they returned, reported back, and that was the end of it. Unfortunately, Warren didn't do anything, mainly because the orders he received were ambiguous, and he spent most of the morning trying to work out what he was supposed to be doing. So meanwhile, what have the rebels been up to? Well, General Lee had pulled back all his troops into their Boyd and Plank mainline trenches, and he probably considered the battle over. So he even sent some of his troops back to Petersburg because he had to juggle his manpower across 30 miles of trenches around Petersburg and Richmond. However, something strange was happening on the Confederate right, which was covered by John Pegram, and he decided to split his force. So Pegram's division was based around the Crow House here. As you see, it's at the extreme right of the Confederate trenches. So that's quite an important position. It also blocks the route to the Boyden Plank Road, Burgess Mill, and the South Side Railroad. So what he did, Pegram took 2 of his brigades and marched south down the Quaker Road to the sharp left of Vaughan Road, where they met some of the Confederate dismounted cavalry who'd been skirmishing with Gregg for most of the morning. This left Gimlet Lee's brigade of less than 800 men to protect this vulnerable part of the rebel position. Now, why he split his division, who told him to, when he was ordered to, what he was hoping to achieve with this movement, no one knows, no one even queries that. So it seems a bit strange to me. It certainly had profound consequences. So a little after 12 noon, the Union managed to sort out their communication problems, and Warren was about to act. He had a visit from Meade himself at his headquarters. And what they decided to do is also somewhat mysterious and strange. So Warren ordered 2 full divisions, infantry divisions, out of the nascent earthworks, down Vaughan Road, and then up the very narrow, windy Dabney's Mill Road to the summit of Dabney's Mill. He also ordered Gregg's cavalry to charge down Vaughan Road and clear it of the dismounted rebel cavalry who they'd been skirmishing with for most of the morning. So the unusual thing about this is that this is not a probe, as you remember what Humphreys had done earlier. This is certainly a reconnaissance in force. That's sort of large numbers of troops involved. So quite what Warren and Meade were up to with this plan, again, never gets discussed in any accounts of the battle. But what is inevitable from both Pegram's decision and Warren's decision is that combat in the afternoon is inevitable around here and here. And that's what happened in the afternoon. So first of all, I'll talk about the fighting on the Vaughan Road before winding the clock back to 1:30 and talking about what happens around Dabney's Mill. So along the Vaughan Road, as ordered, Gregg's cavalry charged the rebel force there, but they got quite the surprise because, as well as just having a few dismounted cavalry, they now were faced by 2 full infantry brigades and John Pegram. So, and unsurprisingly, the cavalry got heavily defeated. They lost many men, particular senior officers, and they had to scramble back along the Vaughan Road with the Confederates gleefully charging after them. The nearby Union infantry brigade of Winthrop was sent to assist. They sent some volleys into the approaching Confederates, and they managed to halt the Confederate advance. And Pegram's force and Winthrop's force exchanged blows and fire for the next hour or so. But Pegram's larger force gradually pushed back Winthrop's men, and they started to run out of ammunition as well. So it's at around 3 o'clock they asked for reinforcements, and Sickles' infantry brigade came out of the Union reserves and arrived at the scene. They held back Pegram's force and also managed to rout it, sending the rebels into the woods for cover. So around 3:30, Pegram regroups his men, and they start to head northwards to the sound of fire around Dabney's Mill and join up with their compatriots there. By about 5 o'clock, the whole of the Vaughan Road was clear of any Confederates all the way down to the Gravelly Crossing. So winding the clock back to 1:30, You remember, we've got 5 Union brigades advancing on Gimlet Lee's brigade, which is based in some nascent earthworks around Dabney's Mill. Now, the problem, I mean, this is obviously overwhelming odds, but the problem that Warren had was that because of the very narrow, windy road, and it was surrounded by dense forest, he couldn't get all his force to the front at the same time. So just to give a bit of context here, the Dabney's Mill itself had long since gone. There was perhaps a bit of ruin and that was it. But what there was a sort of a huge sawdust pile. This is an example of the sort of thing you see. So you've got a huge sawdust pile in a clearing surrounded by this dense forest. And this was where the fighting was generally going to take place. It was a focal point for the soldiers to see this clearing, the nascent earthworks, and this massive pile of sawdust. So as the first regiments of Warren's force started to entangle with Gimlet Lee's Confederates, one of the early casualties was Sally, the mascot dog of the 11th Pennsylvania. We can't seem to have a presentation on Hatcher's Run without mentioning the death of Sally the dog. But there's been 2 books written about this dog, and there isn't a book written about the battle. Tells you what it's about, I guess. So away from the clearing, as I mentioned, this is the sort of terrain that the fighting was taking place in. So dense forest, very gloomy, and then you've got the gun smoke as well. Hard to see. The floor is slick with mud and ice, so it's not ideal or conducive to military operations. So again, cutting a very long story short, General Corps Commander Gordon eventually realised that Gimlet Lee's brigade is going to get overwhelmed by this avalanche of blue advancing towards it. So he sends for reinforcements along his left in the Confederate trenches. And at 2:30, General Evans's rebel division arrived, and they managed to halt the Union advance, and they also managed to push it back beyond the sawmill. So Warren was still filtering fresh troops up to the front, and they managed to get some of Ayre's troops to the front. They attacked Lee and Evans and managed to push them back beyond the site of Dabney's Mill. The Confederates regrouped and counterattacked and pushed the Federals back beyond the sawdust pile once again. So at 4 o'clock, Warren sends for reinforcements in the form of Pearson's Federals, and they arrive around 4:30. You see, that's there. And then they go to the left of the Union line where they join Bowerman's brigade, and they plan to turn the Confederate right by attacking Gimlet Lee's brigade here. Now, who should appear at this exact moment in time? None other than Pegram, who had managed, after being routed by Sickle, had managed to weave his way to the sound of noise, and they arrived at the same time that Pearson and Bowerman were going to launch their attack. So Pearson and Bowerman attack. That goes ahead, and in a hail of bullets, Pegram is killed outright. One of the brigade commanders is severely wounded, but because they've now got 2 extra brigades here, they managed to repel the Union attack. And at 5 o'clock, after 3 hours of bitter fighting around this sawdust pile and roundabouts, there was a noticeable lull appeared on the battlefield. the Union withdrew to about 200 yards southeast of the sawdust pile and started to dig in. The Confederates were in a bit of a state. They were down a division commander, there was down a brigade commander, and a gap had started to appear in their lines. So things were looking a bit precarious. Just a little backstory for you here. John Pegram was the most senior officer killed at the Battle of Hatcher's Run. He was a very popular member of the Richmond Society, and 3 weeks earlier he'd married the famous Southern belle Hetty Carey in a very sumptuous and lavish wedding in Richmond, attended by all the great and good. And they were very much the golden couple of Richmond society. But unfortunately for them, just over 3 weeks later, the same crowd, same congregation with the same priest in the same church were attending his funeral. So it's quite a poignant story indeed. So back to Dabney's Mill. So with the Union digging in and waiting for reinforcements coming up from the south, fortunately for the Confederates, General Joe Finnegan arrives with Mahone's division, but Mahone himself was absent sick. So these 5 brigades arrived and not only solved the gap in the Confederate line, but they spearheaded an all-out assault on the Union position. Now, what happened next? Some of the Union combatants called a great skedaddle. First, the Union line buckled, and then it completely broke. The fleeing Union soldiers were stampeded to the rear in a sort of mad panic, gleefully followed by the rebel soldiers who followed them for over a mile. Fortunately, the Union soldiers managed to get back to sanctuary in these nascent works that had been created along Hatcher's Run, and with night falling, the fighting eventually fizzled out, with the Confederates holding the battlefield. I've written 2 articles about the great skedaddle and trying to piece together what actually happened. So this is just again a brief story. So it's true that many of the Union troops were either low or out of ammunition, and as one private ruefully put there, they're not going to stand there with empty rifles. It's also true that many of the Union soldiers were inexperienced, and prior to that day, many of them had never been shown how to fire a gun. So this inexperience meant that instead of having an orderly retreat, one might expect, you just got this embarrassing stampede to the rear in a mad panic. This panic and fear was exacerbated by many examples of the Union soldiers firing on their own men in gloom and darkness. And we shouldn't take anything away from Mahone's soldiers. They were there, so B's cracked force at Petersburg by that time, and they conducted a very successful attack. So in the days following the great skedaddle, the Union officers, there was lots of finger pointing and self-justification, and trying to pin the blame of this embarrassing rout onto other people and not themselves. So as the weeks and months passed by, it was clear that this event was either ignored or downplayed, and it was something that the officers and men were only too happy to forget about. Now, the fighting might have ended, but the misery certainly hadn't for the soldiers. Overnight, there was an enormous winter storm emerged. There was gale force winds, freezing temperatures, snow, sleet. So these are sort of hungry, tired soldiers. They had little or no protection because they'd travelled light and they were, stuck out on the front line. So they mostly survived by walking around all night because to lie on the floor and try and sleep frozen to death. which unfortunately became the fate of many of the wounded who were left out on the battlefield. So as the morning of February the 7th broke, there was no great enthusiasm to continue the fighting. This is with the exception of Warren. Perhaps he was stung by the embarrassing rout of his soldiers late on the previous day. We don't know, but he was quite keen to continue the fight. Both Grant and Meade were a bit concerned about the morale of his men, given the disaster, as Meade called it, of the Great Skedaddle. But Meade wanted to go back out onto the battlefield and push the strong rebel picket line, which the Skedaddle had got to here, to push them all the way back to the earthworks around Dabney's Mill, which they'd significantly strengthened overnight. So Meade agreed to this, and in the middle of the morning, Warren ordered Crawford's division out of the trenches and started to roll back the rebel pickets. There was another winter storm happened during the morning as well, just to add to the misery of the soldiers. Progress was slow but steady, but the Union force managed to push the pickets back, and by the end of the afternoon, they'd got them all the way back to the defences around Dabney's Mill. Warren reported this success back, and Meade said, "Oh, that's very good. We want you to come back to these trenches here because we're going to keep these, and we don't want you to attack behind the defending position." So whether Warren got these orders in time or whether he just wanted to push matters, still being stung from the previous evening's embarrassment, but he ordered Crawford to attack the defence here, which had now the Confederates had managed to get artillery present there as well. So around 6 o'clock, which would be virtual darkness, Crawford gave the order charge, and the Bluecoats charged up to the rebel position, with the inevitable consequence that they got fairly badly battered. And they tried twice the same sad consequences. But after the second go, common sense eventually prevailed, and they called off the frontal attacks, and the Union men went back into the cover of the woods. Unfortunately, they had to remain there till the early hours of February the 8th, so they had to endure another cold, miserable, hungry night, stuck out in the elements. So when they did eventually retreat back to their lines along Hatcher's Run, this effectively brought to an end the Battle of Hatcher's Run. So what can we gain from this battle? For the Union, remember at the start of the talk, Grant's stated aim was to disrupt the Belfield Plank Road supply line. And given that that supply line was largely abandoned, then discussion of success is somewhat moot. It's true they'd captured with ease and secured 2 strategic Hatcher's Run crossings, which allowed the Union to extend their lines 4 miles further west. This wasn't an original aim, but it certainly was a tangible achievement, a significant achievement. And this was how the mission was sold to the public, the politicians, such that even today, as of then, you still see accounts of saying that this was Grant's cunning plan all along, which of course is nonsense. So the extension of the line provided a good launch pad for the spring campaign, which was to bring the Union final victory. But importantly for Grant, it occupied Lee and his soldiers. There'd been no major fighting in that sector since mid-December, and Grant was one who liked to keep his enemy on his toes and occupied, and it drained Confederacy of more men and encouraged others to desert. So from the Confederate point of view, well, they'd survived yet another Union offensive in the Petersburg sector. They'd maintained control of the Boyden Plank Road. It's true they'd lost 2 strategic Hatcher's Run crossings without putting up much resistance. But despite their tardy response to the advance, they'd managed to focus forces on Humphrey's men late on February the 5th. And if it weren't for sort of timid attacks and poor tactics used then, they should have inflicted more damage than they actually did. But 24 hours later, they had managed to rout Warren's 5th Corps, who had only escaped complete disaster with the presence of nearby defences and the arrival of nightfall. So despite losing precious officers and men and having fairly limited resources, they proved they were still a force to be reckoned with. So by way of epilogue, this is the last substantial fighting around Petersburg before Lee's attempted breakout at Fort Stedman on March the 25th. This, as you probably know, failed, and 2 weeks later, Lee surrendered at Appomattox. And many of the last battles in this campaign were fought in the region that I've just described. So as promised at the start of the talk, here is the sting in my tale. So what I've described to you is a 3-day full-on battle fought in Virginia, the cradle of the Civil War, between none other than Grant and Lee, and also involving other A-list generals. It involved around 60,000 combatants, and there was over 2,500 casualties. It was the only substantial action around Petersburg from mid-December to late March, and this was the central area of the Civil War at that moment in time. And it resulted, as I said, in the last Union line extension in this area. The battle has the notoriety of being the only Civil War battle ever fought in Virginia in a February. 14 medals of honor were awarded to Union soldiers, which is quite a substantial haul. There's many interesting military and personal features associated with the offensive, and I've only just scratched the surface, really. One Southern newspaper called it one of the best fought battles of the war, and there was general consideration amongst Union officers that it was probably the worst performance of the famous 5th Corps during the war. So that's quite an impressive resume, I think, to agree. Yet despite that, surprisingly, this whole offensive has been largely overlooked by history. It's true that 5th Corps reporters hid the truth at the time. They covered up the stampede and they covered up the frontal attacks the following day. You'll find that many combatants' memoirs and regimental histories have ignored this battle or underplayed it. You'll find nothing, for instance, in Grant's extensive memoirs. You'll find absolutely nothing about it in Gordon and Lee's memoirs, despite them being active on all 3 days. Particularly telling is in the totemic 4 volumes Battles and Leaders book, which kind of set the trend for how the Civil War was conceptualized militarily. The battle gets a derisory 1-line footnote. Once neglect has set in, then that's quite easy to perpetuate, and this is what happened throughout the 20th century. And I've catalogued many examples, but I'll just give you 3 Pulitzer Prize-winning examples to do with books and authors I'm sure most of you are going to be familiar with. So Douglas S Freeman's Lee's Lieutenant says absolutely nothing about this battle. Bruce Catton's Stillness at Appomattox, which features exclusively the last few months of the war, says absolutely nothing about this battle. James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom is arguably the best 1-volume account of the war. It's not mentioned either. What you do find with Hatcher's Run is that they get accounts of you get summary chapters in books that feature the whole 9 months of the Petersburg campaign. And all these are written by illustrious authors and historians. They all contain significant errors and gaps. So we have a bit of a absurd situation in that the leading protagonist, when trying to resurrect this epic but forgotten battle, is none other than a retired UK biochemist / social scientist. So, of course, I haven't done all my research on my own, and here's certainly not a comprehensive list, but quite a good representation of all the people who've helped me in my research and are also quite keen to see that this battle gets the recognition that it truly deserves. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.